The yard lights were still on when Ron Halverson's pickup rolled past for the third time that morning. Earl Voss saw it from the kitchen window, didn't flinch, didn't move, just wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and watched those headlights drag slowly across his frost-covered fields like a searchlight on a prison yard. It was November of 1979. The temperature in Perkins County, Nebraska had dropped to 9 degrees overnight. And somewhere inside that enormous corrugated steel shed behind Earl's farmhouse, a shed that smelled of gear oil and old hay, and something Earl's father used to call good honest iron, there were now 43 Layne-Bowler turbine irrigation pumps that didn't belong to Earl Voss. Not yet. Let me tell you about Perkins County, Nebraska. It sits in the southwestern corner of the state, where the land goes flat in a way that isn't emptiness so much as openness. In the summer, center pivot irrigation systems spin slow, lazy circles over the fields, mile-wide green wheels of corn and soybeans turning under a sky so enormous it makes you feel both very small and very free at the same time. In November, though, Perkins County is something else entirely. The wind comes in off the Colorado Plateau and it doesn't apologize for anything. It pushes the dry corn husks across the blacktop roads and rattles the corrugated aluminum of grain bins until the whole landscape seems to be shivering. This was 1979. Jimmy Carter was in the White House. Interest rates were climbing like a fever nobody could break. They'd hit 13% by the end of that year and they weren't done. The farm economy was caught in a slow squeeze that most farmers wouldn't fully feel for another 2 or 3 years. But the men who watched these things closely, the bankers, the dealers, the ones who made their money not from the land but off the people who worked it, those men already sensed it coming. The town of Grant, Nebraska, population under 1,000. The seat of Perkins County. 3 grain elevators, 2 banks, 1 John Deere dealership, and a farm equipment lending outfit called High Plains Agricultural Credit, or HPAC, as everyone in the county called it, that held the notes on more irrigation equipment than most people realized. And sitting 12 miles north of Grant on a section and a half of sandy loam that had been in his family since 1924 was Earl Voss. Earl Thomas Voss was 58 years old in 1979. He stood 6 feet even and had the hands of a man who'd been pulling pipe and turning wrenches since before he was old enough to drive a tractor. His hair had gone to silver sometime in the early 70s, and he wore it combed neat even on work days. His wife, Lorraine, said he looked like a Sunday school teacher who'd accidentally ended up farming. She meant it as a compliment. Earl had come back from Korea in 1953 with a slight hitch in his left knee and a very clear understanding that the 2 things he was best at in this world were fixing things and growing corn. He'd taken over his father's operation in 1961, expanded it slowly and carefully through the 60s, and drilled his first irrigation well in 1968, outfitting it himself with a Layne-Bowler Model 14 HB turbine pump, a pump he'd bought second-hand from a farm sale over in Hays County, and completely rebuilt in his own shop over the course of 1 winter. That was the thing about Earl Voss. He didn't just use equipment, he understood it. He could take a turbine pump apart and lay every piece out on his shop floor and tell you exactly what each one did and why and what would happen if it was worn. He'd learned irrigation mechanics from an old driller named Clifford Siebert who used to say, "Earl, a pump doesn't care who owns it, it only cares if you understand it." By 1979, Earl had 4 wells of his own, all running Layne-Bowler equipment he'd maintained himself for over a decade. His corn averaged 142 bushels an acre in a year when the county average was 118. He didn't talk about this. He never talked about his yields, but the numbers were there in the grain elevator records for anyone who wanted to look. Earl Voss was not a rich man, but he was a solvent man, which in Perkins County, Nebraska, in the autumn of 1979 was becoming an increasingly rare and valuable thing to be. He had something else too. He had that shed. Built in 1971, poured concrete floor, 80 feet long by 40 feet wide, with a 16-foot clearance and 3 oversized roll-up doors. Earl had built it bigger than he needed because his father had always said, "The shed you wish you'd built bigger is the one you built exactly the size you needed." In November of 1979, most of that shed was empty. It wouldn't stay that way for long. Ron Halverson had come to Grant in 1971 from Omaha, where he'd spent 4 years working in agricultural lending for a regional bank. He was 41 in 1979. He wore pressed khakis and a sheepskin vest regardless of the weather and drove a tan Chevy Silverado that he traded in every 2 years for a newer one. In a county full of men who wore denim and drove trucks with rust on the quarter panels, this made an impression, just not always a good one. Ron had parlayed his banking background into something very specific. He'd become the branch manager of HPAC, the High Plains Agricultural Credit Office in Grant. HPAC wasn't a bank exactly, it was a specialty lender that financed irrigation infrastructure: wells, pivots, pumps, motors, mainline pipe. If you needed water to come out of the ground in southwestern Nebraska in the 1970s and you didn't have the cash to pay for it outright, there was a fair chance Ron Halverson had a hand in your paperwork. And Ron was good at his job, ruthlessly, methodically good. He understood the mechanics of interest rates and collateral the way Earl understood pump bearings. He could look at a farm operation's income projections versus its debt service and tell you within a few minutes whether the numbers worked. The problem with Ron Halverson was not his competence. The problem was what his competence had done to his character. He'd spent 8 years watching farmers come into his office with their hats in their hands, and somewhere along the way he developed the private belief, never stated outright but present in every meeting, visible in the way he talked over people and the way he smiled when he presented bad news, that the men across the desk from him simply weren't as smart as he was. He talked about his farmers and he called them his farmers, which should tell you something, the way a chess player talks about his pieces: useful, deployable, replaceable. He did not talk about Earl Voss that way. He didn't talk about Earl much at all, actually. Earl made Ron Halverson uncomfortable, and men like Ron Halverson don't like to examine the things that make them uncomfortable too closely. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known someone who was genuinely good at what they did, skilled, careful, patient, and watched someone with more authority dismiss them like they were nothing? Hold on to that feeling, because what's about to happen in Perkins County is going to be very familiar. The meeting happened in March of 1981. By then, interest rates in America had climbed to 19%, not 13, 19. If you had borrowed $80,000 to put in an irrigation system in 1977 at a rate that seemed manageable, you were now staring at monthly payments that had restructured themselves into something that looked like a slow financial drowning. Farmers across the Great Plains were in trouble. Not all of them and not all at once, but the wave was visible to anyone watching. Corn prices had been good in 1979 and 1980. But the grain embargo Jimmy Carter placed on Soviet shipments in January of 1980 had knocked the legs out from under export demand, and the land values that farmers had borrowed against were beginning to wobble. HPAC had in the previous 6 months sent default notices to 11 farmers in Perkins County alone. Most of those defaults were on irrigation equipment loans. The collateral was the equipment itself: turbine pumps, motors, panel boxes, column pipe. When a farmer defaulted, HPAC was entitled to seize the equipment and store it, pending resale or lease to another operation. This was the problem. HPAC had no warehouse, no storage yard, no facility of any kind suitable for storing precision agricultural equipment through a Nebraska winter. Ron Halverson needed a place. He drove out to Earl's farm on a cold Tuesday morning in March. He sat down at Lorraine's kitchen table, accepted the coffee she offered, and laid out his proposal. HPAC would pay Earl $75 a month per unit per pump to store repossessed irrigation equipment in Earl's shed. Earl would be responsible for receiving the equipment when it arrived, cataloging it, and keeping the building heated enough that seals and motor windings didn't deteriorate. Earl asked 3 questions. First, what were the terms of the arrangement, month to month or a defined contract? Ron said month to month. HPAC expected to resell most of the equipment within a year. Second, who held liability if equipment was damaged while in storage? Ron said HPAC retained full liability but expected Earl to exercise reasonable care. He slid a 2-page agreement across the table. Third, what was the maximum number of units they anticipated storing? Ron leaned back in his chair and smiled the smile of a man who believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered. 12, maybe 15 at the outside. We don't anticipate a lot of defaults. He said that last part with a small laugh, the kind of laugh that says you wouldn't understand the complexities I manage. Earl looked at the agreement for a long moment, then he looked up. I'll need the rate to be $90 a month per unit, Earl said. And I'll need a clause that says if HPAC fails to reclaim equipment within 36 months of storage, title defaults to me as storage lienholder under Nebraska statutes. Ron Halverson blinked. He'd heard of storage lien laws. Most agricultural lenders had. Under Nebraska Revised Statute 52201, a person who provides storage for goods has a lien on those goods for the unpaid cost of storage. If the owner fails to reclaim the goods and pay the storage fees, the lien can ultimately result in the lienholder acquiring title. Ron was not worried about this. He fully intended to have the equipment moved and sold within 18 months, 2 years at the outside. The lien clause was a curiosity, a formality, the kind of thing a careful man asks for. He glanced at Earl across the table, this silver-haired, quiet-spoken farmer with his coffee cup and his careful questions, and made a decision based on something other than the numbers in front of him. He decided Earl was not sophisticated enough to really understand what he was asking for, just a cautious farmer wanting something on paper to feel protected. $85 a month, Ron said, and the lien clause, fine. They shook hands. The following week, the first truck arrived. 2 Layne-Bowler Model 16 HC turbine pumps, 60 horsepower motors, column pipe strapped to the flatbed. Earl helped the driver unload them. He cataloged them on an index card, pump serial numbers, motor specs, condition at arrival, and rolled the first one into position against the east wall of his shed. He did not smile. He just went back to work. By the end of 1982, Earl had 31 pumps in his shed. Ron Halverson had long since stopped smiling about his 12 to 15 estimate. Here is what Ron Halverson did not know, what he could not have known, because understanding it required spending 25 years getting your hands dirty in ways that a man in a sheepskin vest and pressed khakis simply hadn't done. Ron Halverson did not know what a Layne-Bowler turbine pump is actually worth. Not the book value, not the replacement cost. The actual value, the value to a farmer who needs water to come out of the ground next spring at precisely the right volume and pressure to run his center pivot. Who needs that pump to work perfectly and not fail at 2 in the afternoon on July 14th when the corn is tasseling and the temperature is 102 degrees, and a field call to the nearest dealer is a minimum 4-hour wait. That value is considerably higher than the loan balance on the HPAC books. But there was something Ron understood even less than the market value of the pumps. He didn't understand what it meant that Earl Voss was not simply storing those pumps. Earl was caring for them. He went through each unit that arrived and made a condition assessment, far more detailed than the index card he'd shown Ron. In a gray-covered composition notebook he kept on the workbench, he wrote down everything: the bearing wear, the impeller condition, the shaft straightness, the state of the mechanical seals, the motor winding resistance when he tested it with his old fluke meter. He noted which units needed new seals, which had corrosion in the bowl castings, which had been run dry, and showed the telltale scoring on the wear rings that told you someone had operated them without adequate submergence. He didn't do this because HPAC was paying him to. The contract only required reasonable care, which most people would have interpreted as keeping the building heated and the equipment dry. Earl did it because he was Earl Voss. Because Clifford Siebert had told him that you don't ignore equipment that needs attention just because it doesn't belong to you. Because these pumps were precision instruments, and a man who understood precision instruments could not watch them deteriorate without doing something about it. He sourced parts from a supply house in North Platte. He paid for them out of his own pocket, keeping careful receipts, logging the expenditures in the composition notebook under each pump's serial number. The HPAC storage fees were accumulating, $85 a month per unit. By the end of 1982, it was 31 units, which was $2,635 a month, or $31,620 a year. This was not an insignificant sum in Perkins County in 1982. Earl put it in a separate savings account and did not touch it. He also called the Layne-Bowler factory rep, a man named Dwayne Ellsworth out of Wichita, Kansas, and told him what he had. Dwayne drove up in February of 1983, spent a full day in the shed with Earl, and left visibly impressed. "You've got a museum," Dwayne told him. "A working museum. Half these units haven't been cared for this well since they left the factory." Earl wrote Dwayne's direct line in the composition notebook. By 1983, the farm crisis had reached its full devastating pitch across the Great Plains. Interest rates had peaked. Land values were in freefall. In Perkins County alone, the following year would see 3 farm foreclosure auctions, the first the county had seen since the 1930s. Neighbors who'd farmed the same ground for 2 and 3 generations were losing it. Earl watched all of this from his farm, which remained solvent. His debt was minimal, his yields were consistent, and his shed, now holding 43 units by the spring of 1984, was generating him more money per month than most of his neighbors were clearing from their crops. Ron Halverson drove past occasionally. The trucks kept coming. Each time, Earl helped unload, cataloged the new arrival, assessed its condition, and rolled it into position in the shed where the fluorescent lights hummed and the smell of gear oil and his father's old iron hung in the air like a kind of memory. He did not say much on these occasions. He was building something and he understood it, and he was patient. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been patient in a way that nobody around you could see? Patient in a way that required you to simply keep doing the right thing while everyone else was moving fast and loud and certain. That's what Earl Voss was doing in that shed every single day for 15 years. The date was April 3, 1994. 15 years and 1 month after Ron Halverson had sat at Lorraine's kitchen table and explained that he didn't anticipate a lot of defaults. Earl Voss got a phone call that morning from a lawyer in Omaha named Patricia Thorne, who represented the bankruptcy estate of HPAC, High Plains Agricultural Credit, which had filed for Chapter 7 liquidation on March 18, 1994. Farm crisis had lasted longer than anyone predicted. HPAC's loan portfolio had never fully recovered. A series of bad restructuring decisions in the late 80s, taking on riskier operating loans to offset the losses on irrigation equipment, had compounded the problem. There had been new management, then more new management. Ron Halverson had left the grant office in 1988 and gone back to Omaha. A succession of increasingly overwhelmed branch managers had followed him. Through all of it, the pumps in Earl's shed had stayed exactly where they were. HPAC had sold some units in the early years, 7 of them, mostly to larger operations in neighboring counties. But the credit office was in disarray, the resale market was weak, and the paperwork required to move equipment out of storage had kept getting bumped behind more urgent crises. The pumps sat. Earl kept caring for them. And he kept sending the invoice every month, $85 per unit per month, to the address on the contract, certified mail, return receipt requested. Some months the check came back promptly. Some months it took 2 or 3 reminders. In the last 3 years, HPAC had fallen 19 months behind on payments. Earl had those receipts, all of them, 15 years of certified mail receipts in a file folder in the cabinet next to the gray composition notebooks, 4 of them now, 1 for each period of his record keeping. Patricia Thorne, the bankruptcy attorney, called to inform Earl that as a creditor of HPAC, which he was, owing to the unpaid storage fees, he was entitled to file a claim with the bankruptcy court. The estate would liquidate its assets to pay creditors in order of priority. She paused then, the way lawyers pause when they are about to say something delicate. Mr. Voss, I also need to ask about the equipment stored on your property. The estate would like to arrange for retrieval. Earl said, Mrs. Thorne, I'd encourage you to review the storage agreement before we go much further, specifically the lien clause. There was a pause. I'm sorry. The lien clause, Earl said again. Section 4 of the storage agreement dated March 12, 1981. It states that if HPAC fails to reclaim stored equipment within 36 months and fails to maintain current payment of storage fees, title to the stored equipment transfers to me as the storage lien holder under Nebraska Revised Statute 52201. They've had more than 36 months on all but the last 3 units that arrived. And they're 19 months behind on payments. I have the certified mail receipts and the returned checks. Silence on the line. Not a brief pause. Actual silence, the kind that has a weight to it. Patricia Thorne asked Earl if he had representation. He said no. She said very quietly that he might want to get some. He called a lawyer in North Platte named Don Hargreaves, who reviewed the agreement and the notebooks and the mail receipts, and called Earl back 2 days later with a voice that sounded like a man who had just found something extraordinary. Earl, Don said, in 30 years of agricultural law, I have never seen documentation kept like this. Every unit, every invoice, every receipt. If this goes to court, it won't go to court for very long. It did not go to court for very long. The bankruptcy proceeding took 8 months. There were objections from the estate. There were counterclaims. There were phone calls from a representative of the new owners of HPAC's parent company, a firm from Dallas, Texas, who seemed genuinely disbelieving that this was the legal situation they'd inherited. Earl went to one deposition in Omaha. He brought the 4 composition notebooks and the file folder and sat at a conference table and answered every question calmly and precisely and showed every document when asked. The Dallas firm's attorney asked Earl at one point why he had kept such meticulous records. Earl thought about it for a moment. "Because these were good pumps," he said, "and because somebody had to." On December 19, 1994, 9 months and 16 days after Patricia Thorne's phone call, the Perkins County District Court entered a judgment confirming Earl Voss's storage lien and the resulting title transfer. He drove home through a light Nebraska snowfall and told Lorraine. She made him a piece of chocolate cake. The next morning he walked out to the shed. The yard light was still on, frost on the ground. He rolled up the main door and stood there in the cold air, looking at the rows of pumps, 36 Layne-Bowler turbine units in various configurations. From the old Model 14 HB he'd received first all the way to some newer Model 20 HC units, plus a collection of motors, panel assemblies, and several pallets of carefully organized column pipe. The total replacement value, as assessed by Dwayne Ellsworth and 2 other irrigation industry professionals who later submitted reports to the court, was $847,000 in 1994 dollars. Earl had paid approximately $14,200 in parts and maintenance over 15 years. His net from the unpaid storage fees, which he was also awarded in the judgment, was $68,400. He was 63 years old. He had done this with patience and index cards and a fluke meter and 4 gray composition notebooks. He stood in the doorway of the shed for a long time, listening to the Nebraska wind, smelling gear oil and old iron. The news traveled through Perkins County the way news always travels in small counties, unevenly, fast, with embellishment. By January of 1995, the basic shape of the story was known at both grain elevators, at the coffee counter of the Perkins County Diner on the south end of Main Street in Grant, and in the waiting room of the Farm Service Agency office where farmers gathered to discuss the arcane and perpetually shifting terrain of federal agricultural policy. The reactions were various. Some men who'd lost their equipment in the farm crisis, men whose pumps were now sitting in Earl Voss's shed with a Nebraska court's title transfer paperwork attached to them, felt a complicated mix of things. Relief wasn't exactly it. Vindication wasn't quite right either. Something closer to at least somebody came out of this hole. A man they respected, a man who'd always been straight with them. Nobody who knew Earl was surprised that he'd kept the records. That was exactly what Earl Voss would do. What surprised people was the scale that he'd held on that long, that he'd maintained every unit through 15 Nebraska winters, that he'd been patient enough to let time work for him when everyone around him was scrambling and panicking and losing things. The men who'd sat in Ron Halverson's office and watched him smile across the desk. Some of them were at the Perkins County Diner that January when the story was being recounted in detail for what was probably the 4th or 5th time. They drank their coffee and they were quiet. Not embarrassed, not angry. Just quiet with something that felt, in the way of older men who have seen a lot, like respect. And Ron Halverson himself, he was in Omaha by then. He'd moved on to a different lending institution. He heard about it eventually, word gets back, but he said nothing on record, at least nothing anyone repeated. Perhaps because there wasn't anything to say. The man he'd dismissed as a careful but unsophisticated farmer had understood the contract better than he had maintained the equipment better than HPAC ever would have, had kept documentation that would have satisfied the requirements of any court in any state. Earl Voss had simply done what he always did, paid attention, did the work, kept the records, and waited. And the waiting had been the strategy all along. Earl Voss did not become wealthy from the pumps. That is not how this story ends. What he did was this. He spent the first 3 months of 1995 going through every unit in the shed with Dwayne Ellsworth, completing a final condition assessment and preparing each pump for sale or lease. Of the 36 units, 22 were in excellent working condition, better, Dwayne said, than most units he saw that were currently in active use, because Earl had maintained them through a period when many operators would have let them sit and corrode. 8 required moderate reconditioning, 6 needed significant work. Earl sold 11 units outright over the following 2 years, to farmers in Perkins County, Dundee County, Chase County, and across the border in Colorado. He priced them at approximately 60% of new below market for reconditioned pumps in the kind of condition these were, because he was selling to farmers, and he understood what 60% of new meant to a farmer versus what it meant to a dealer. He leased 7 units long-term to operations that couldn't afford to purchase. The lease revenue ran for years. He kept 10 units for parts inventory, a decision that Dwayne Ellsworth initially thought was peculiar, until a Layne-Bowler Model 16 HC Bowl assembly failed on a farm in Hays County at 5 p.m. on a Saturday in August of 1996, and the nearest dealer's earliest delivery was Monday morning. Earl had the part. He drove it over himself that evening. The remaining 8 units he rebuilt over the next 4 years, evenings and winters, in the shed with the fluorescent lights humming, and sold them as fully reconditioned units with his own labor warranty. He charged $4,200 per unit. They were worth every cent. What this meant in practical terms was that Earl Voss had generated an additional income stream in his late 60s and early 70s that allowed him to do something he'd never been able to do before: invest in his own operation without borrowing to do it. He put in a new well in 1997, paid for it in cash. He bought a quarter section from an estate sale in 1999 at a price that was, by 1999, very fair. He and Lorraine took a trip to see the Grand Canyon in the summer of 1998, first real vacation they'd taken in 30 years. But the aftermath that matters most isn't the money. In the spring of 1996, a young farmer named Curtis Yeager came out to the shed to look at one of the pumps Earl was offering. Curtis was 29 years old and had recently taken over his family's 640 acres following his father's stroke. He was behind before he'd started. The operation had debt he hadn't created and equipment that was older than it should have been. He and Earl spent 3 hours in that shed. Earl showed him every pump, how to assess condition, what to listen for, what the wear pattern on an impeller told you about how the pump had been run. He showed Curtis his notebooks. He walked him through the storage lien statutes. Curtis Yeager bought a pump that day. He also came back twice more that year just to talk, and Earl let him. Years later, Curtis told his own son, "Earl Voss taught me more about this business in 3 conversations than I learned in 20 years of doing it wrong." Earl also submitted his composition notebooks, all 4 of them, to the University of Nebraska Extension Service office in North Platte, where a farm management specialist named Karen Dolzel used them as a case study in a workshop on agricultural recordkeeping and storage lien law. The workshop ran for 4 years. The case of Earl Voss and the HPAC pumps became, in the circles of Nebraska agricultural law and farm finance, something of a landmark example. Not because it was dramatic, because it was patient. Earl farmed until he was 78. Lorraine passed in 2007. He followed in 2012 at 89 in the farmhouse his grandfather had built in 1924. The shed is still standing. His son runs the operation now. The cement floor where 43 irrigation pumps once sat is occupied by 2 newer tractors and a combine header. But if you look closely at the east wall, where Earl always started the rows, where pump number 1 had arrived on that cold November morning in 1979, you can still see the marks in the concrete where the cradles sat. Shallow indentations, worn smooth. The kind of marks that tell you something heavy and important was here for a long time. Let me tell you what I think about when I think about Earl Voss. I don't think about the $847,000 appraisal or the bankruptcy judgment or the certified mail receipts. Those are just the instruments of the story, the tools through which something deeper expressed itself. I think about 15 Nebraska winters. I think about a man who got up every morning, walked out to a shed full of other people's equipment, and cared for it as though it were his own. Not because he'd been paid to, not because he was certain how things would turn out, but because he was the kind of man who could not look at something that needed tending and walk past it without tending it. There is a school of thought in modern business, in modern life really, that says patience is passive, that waiting is not a strategy, that the people who win are the ones who move fast and act bold and make their presence loudly known. Ron Halverson believed something like that. He was smart, he was credentialed, he had authority and he used it, and he looked at Earl Voss across a kitchen table and decided in about 30 seconds that he understood the situation better than the man he was looking at. He was wrong in every way that mattered. Earl Voss knew something that can't be taught in a lending institution or an MBA program or a conference room in Dallas, Texas. He knew that understanding is not the same as being loud about understanding. He knew that preparation made silently is still preparation. He knew that the man who keeps his records and cares for his equipment and reads the contract carefully and waits, that man is not the underdog. Not really. That man is the most dangerous person in the room. He just doesn't look like it yet. There is wisdom in old things. In old equipment, yes, Dwayne Ellsworth was right that those pumps were better maintained than most of what was running in active fields, but also in old ways of doing things. In the patient accumulation of knowledge over years. In the habit of writing things down not because someone is watching, but because precision is its own reward and because, someday, the record might matter. And there is something else worth saying. When the farm crisis came, when it stripped away the operations of men who had borrowed too much and been squeezed by forces larger than any individual farmer could fight, Earl Voss did not gloat. He did not profit from their suffering. He charged a fair price for the pumps he sold. He sold below market to farmers who needed the break. He drove parts over on Saturday evenings. He was not better than the men who lost their operations. He was luckier in some ways, positioned differently, but he used his position to help, not to extract. That too is a kind of wisdom. They piled their seized pumps in his shed for 15 years. The dealers and the bankers and the courts of the farm crisis, all of them certain they understood more about these machines, about the situation, than the quiet man with the gray composition notebooks. Then the dealer folded. In Earl Voss had everyone. If you know a farmer who kept going when everyone else said quit, someone who understood something about patience and old machines that the world rushed past without seeing, I want to hear about them. Tell me in the comments. These stories deserve to be told. For the forgotten farmer, I'm grateful you stayed with us. Historical context is real. The American farm crisis of the 1980s, Nebraska Storage Lien Law, Nebraska Revised Statute 52201, Layne-Bowler turbine irrigation pump specifications, and agricultural credit conditions of the 1979-1994 period are drawn from historical record. Earl Voss, Ron Halverson, HPAC, and all named individuals and businesses are fictional. Dialogue in specific events are dramatized for storytelling purposes.